Atlético de Madrid has just rejected 100 million euros for Julián Álvarez. And what's curious is that after rejecting such an offer, the feeling around this story isn't that the transfer is dead. It's exactly the opposite. Because normally, when a club rejects an offer of that size, the story ends there. That's it. Each one goes their own way. But here's something very strange is happening. The more Atlético de Madrid tries to close the door, the more noise appears around Julián Álvarez. More journalists are talking. More information is coming from Argentina. More questions are appearing. And that's why today we're not just going to talk about an offer. We're going to talk about something much more important. We're going to talk about the exact moment when a transfer stops depending on money and starts depending entirely on the player himself. Because I have the feeling that we're getting close to that point. And when we get there, everything can change. Because it's one thing for Atlético de Madrid not to want to sell, and it's a very different thing for Julián to want to stay. And that's where the real problem is, not for Barça, but for Atlético de Madrid. Because while the club keeps trying to convey calm, messages keep coming from Argentina, that point in exactly the opposite direction. And here appears a man who becomes the protagonist again, Gastón Edul. Because when he talks about the Argentine national team and about footballers of this level, he is usually very well informed. And what he is saying again is exactly the same. Total agreement between Julián Álvarez and FC Barcelona football. Total. And this is key, because we're no longer talking about convincing the player. We're no longer talking about presenting him with sporting plans. We're no longer talking about whether he likes the idea of coming to Barcelona or not. We're talking about something completely different. We're talking about a footballer who has reportedly already made a decision. And when a player of this level makes a decision, the hard part begins for the club that's trying to keep him. And because there's a conversation that still hasn't happened, and when it does, it could change the whole summer. One conversation, two people, Julián Álvarez, Diego Pablo Simeone, nothing else, because Fernando Polo, a colleague from Mundo Deportivo, shared this reflection a few hours ago. We'll see what happens when Julián sits down with Simeone and tells him face to face that he doesn't want to continue. And there, dear family, is the bombshell. That's where it is. That's the crux of the matter, because until now, we've talked about million-dollar offers, journalists, and rumors. But we still haven't reached that decisive moment. We haven't gotten to that face-to-face yet. Because if that day comes, oh my, the situation could change drastically. Because no coach wants to build a project around a player whose mind is already somewhere else. No club wants to spend the whole summer fighting against the will of its own star. That's why Atlético de Madrid is trying to buy time. That's why they've rejected Barça's offer. That's why they're sending strong messages, because they know perfectly well that the most dangerous scenario isn't a 100 million euro offer. The most dangerous scenario is a determined Julián. And this is where Fabrizio Romano comes in, because after he published Barcelona's offer, something very striking happened. There were taunts, messages, replies, and many expected Fabrizio to hide, to tone it down, to take a step back. But he did exactly the opposite. He laughed and responded with a phrase that I find fascinating. He said he finds the words and messages from Atlético de Madrid on Twitter funny. And he commented, "I'm glad that such a big and important club like Atlético de Madrid follows me so much." And after adding this, he said something that will give people a lot to talk about. "I hope they follow me and have notifications turned on." This seems like a joke, but it's also a message. Because it doesn't sound like someone who thinks the story is over. It sounds like someone who believes that a lot of things are still going to happen. And that fits perfectly with what keeps coming day after day from the Argentina national team. Because no one close to the team or around the player is saying that the deal is dead. On the contrary, it's quite the opposite. The feeling is that this will be long, difficult, complex, but very much alive. And this is where the factor that scares Atlético de Madrid the most comes in. Time, because many times we believe that time helps the selling club, but not always. Sometimes time helps the player. Because the longer the situation drags on, the more conversations come up, the more wear and tear there is, the more pressure from the media, and it's even harder to contain. That's why many within Barça believe that the real operation hasn't even started yet. Because right now, Julián is already away with Argentina, and his attention is on the World Cup. Right now, there are other priorities. But imagine for a moment that the tournament ends. Imagine that Julián sits down with his people. Imagine that he talks to his agent again. Imagine that Barça shows up again. And now imagine that conversation with Simeone finally happens. That's where the real story begins. And that's where we'll find out who really has control of this story. Because while everyone is looking at Julián, Deco keeps building Flick's team. And here comes another name that's starting to be mentioned a lot. Marco Kurela. Because Barça isn't just looking for a striker. They're trying to build a squad capable of competing for everything. And the defensive problems are still there. That's why names like Kurela are being mentioned more than ever today and fit perfectly into the planning that's being done. Deco knows the club, the philosophy. He has experience at the highest level. And he fits exactly the profile that Hansi Flick is looking for. This is important because it shows one thing. While some are negotiating for Julián, Barça keeps moving forward with other deals. They're not waiting, they're building. That gives a sense of a very powerful project because Gordon has already arrived and because other moves are still progressing. Ansu Fati left, Marc Casado is about to leave, offers are coming in for players like Ferran Torres, but in the end, everything comes back to Julián Álvarez. Because the story of the summer has a name and surname, Julián Álvarez. He wants to play for Barça, and Barça wants him to be their star. Will Atlético de Madrid be able to keep Julián? That's the question, and the more days go by, the harder it is to answer. Because Atlético de Madrid keeps saying no, and will probably keep saying no for quite some time. But the signs keep appearing, journalists keep insisting, information keeps coming in, and everything points in the same direction. The player's wishes. So when does a deal of this size start to revolve around what the player wants? Normally, the story is far from over, but actually be careful. That's usually when it really begins. That's why we trust completely that Julián Álvarez will end up being a Barça player. It's a matter of time. We have to be patient. Don't fall into the trap. Let's stay calm. Barça, with Deco and Hansi Flick, are planning and have every move they want to make perfectly in mind to build the best squad possible. Barça is working hard to get the best team in the world, and we're already on the right track. In time, everything will fall into place. If you liked the video, leave your opinion about the topic in the comments, smash the like button, hype up the video, and subscribe to the channel to reach 500,000 followers. Barça yesterday, Barça today, Barça forever.